Kiana Atkins was used to airports. Used to the long security lines. The hurried footsteps. The polite nods exchanged between strangers rushing toward their destinations. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport that day. It started with a smirk, a uniformed officer glancing at her ID. Chuckling under his breath like he had just heard the punchline of a joke she wasn't in on. "Funny ID," he murmured, holding it just out of reach. Then, just when she thought it was over, a man was tackled to the ground, a child gasping for air. And suddenly, Kiana found herself in the middle of something much bigger than a security check. But here's the thing, this wasn't just an accident. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a pattern, a system at work, and this time, it had picked the wrong woman to silence. What would you do if it happened to you? If someone with a badge decided they could control your story? Would you fight back? Would you speak up? Before we dive into this unbelievable true story, tell me, where are you watching from? Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Now, let's begin. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport thrummed with the weight of a million journeys. A crossroads of departures and arrivals where lives brushed past each other like hurried whispers in a crowd. The smell of brewed coffee clung to the air, mixing with the crisp scent of disinfectant and the distant echo of rolling suitcases. Kiana Atkins stood amidst it all, a lone figure in a sea of motion, her heartbeat steady, her mind already fixed on the destination ahead: Houston. Home, where familiar arms and warm voices waited beyond the hum of security lines and flight announcements. She had done this countless times before, maneuvering through the ritual of travel with the ease of experience. The rhythm of it was second nature. Remove the shoes. Separate the electronics. Slide the backpack onto the conveyor belt. But today, something was different. It wasn't in the weight of her bag or the steel frame of the detector, it was in the way the officer watched her. The way his eyes lingered just a second too long. Assessing, calculating. A beep. It was sharp, mechanical, indifferent. Kiana froze mid-step, the quiet ripple of inconvenience passing through her like a shiver in warm air. A second check. That was all. Perhaps a metal hairclip. A forgotten penny in her pocket. It was a small thing. The kind of minor disruption people brushed off a dozen times a day. But when the officer motioned her to step aside, when he tilted his head and let a slow smirk pull at the corner of his mouth, she knew in the way a woman learns the language of unspoken dismissals. Knew in the way a black traveler learns to brace for what may come. "ID, please." There was no courtesy in his tone, just the clipped efficiency of authority unchallenged. Kiana reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the familiar curve of her wallet. "Sure," she said, keeping her voice even, smooth as glass. She held out the card. Texas printed, valid, unquestionable. A piece of plastic with her face stamped onto it. A document as unremarkable as it was essential. But the officer didn't just take it, he studied it, turning it over like a puzzle missing a piece. His eyes flickered from the photo to her face, then back again, and then, with a small, mocking chuckle, he lifted it between his fingers, holding it up as if examining an artifact he didn't quite believe in. "Funny ID," he murmured. It was a quiet thing, meant just for her, a private joke with an audience of one. Funny. Like her existence was an anomaly. Like her presence here was an error in the system. A question that demanded an answer. For a moment, the world around them blurred. The overhead announcements. The rustling of boarding passes. The chime of rolling luggage. There was only the weight of his smirk. The slow, deliberate pause before he spoke again. "You sure this is you?" The words weren't a question. They were a verdict. Kiana felt the heat rise, not of embarrassment, but of something deeper. Something sharp and silent that settled behind her ribs. She had a choice now. A choice she had been given in classrooms where teachers overlooked her raised hand. In meetings where her ideas were attributed to someone else. In stores where eyes followed her too closely. Stay small. Stay compliant. Make it easy. Laugh it off. Smooth it over. Let it slide. Or stand. She took a breath. "That's my ID," she said, steady, firm, no room for doubt. A beat of silence. The officer pursed his lips in mock consideration. Then with a theatrical flourish, flicked the card toward her like a magician revealing an empty deck. "Double-checking," he said, his smirk widening. "You understand." She did. "Oh, She understood perfectly. She caught the cart mid-air, her fingers closing around it with precision. She could feel the stares now, the passing glances of strangers catching just the edge of the scene. Some curious, some disinterested, the unspoken tension curled between them. A thing made of years, of history, of echoes too familiar to name. And then, like a hand slamming onto the reset button of fate, the airport broke into motion again. A sudden commotion at the far end of the terminal. A man, frantic, pushing through the crowd, shouting a name. Officers turned, drawn to the disruption like moths to flame. The moment shattered. Kiana stepped forward, her feet moving on instinct, her breath steady, her pulse a drum against her skin. She wasn't done with this, not yet. But she had a flight to catch. And she was not going to miss it. Not today. Not ever. The air in the terminal seemed to crackle, charged with the kind of tension that travelers pretended not to notice. People were always moving, always watching, and yet never truly seeing. Kiana stepped forward, clutching her ID with fingers that had memorized the shape of injustice. But she would not let her feet drag beneath its weight. She was leaving this checkpoint behind, stepping toward the future she had built, not the one others tried to assign to her. And then chaos. A man's voice sliced through the murmur of the crowd. Desperate, pleading, "Wait, please, I just need to get it to her." The sound of hurried footsteps. The shuffle of passengers pulling their children closer. The sharp intake of breath as people recognized what was happening before it fully unfolded. Kiana turned, just in time to see him. A black man, mid-30s, running not in the reckless, aimless way that triggers alarms, but in the determined, singular motion of someone with purpose. His suit jacket flapped behind him. His shoes, scuffed but professional, barely making a sound against the gleaming airport floors. He clutched something in his hand, something small and silver, but what mattered wasn't the object, it was the sheer terror in his eyes. "Stop!" The command rang out like a hammer to glass. A police officer, Officer KS, already moving, his body cutting through space like a predator that had spotted an opening. His face, a mask of authority wrapped in suspicion. The man didn't slow down. He should have. That's what they'd say later. What they'd whisper in statements and reports. He should have stopped, should have frozen in place, should have raised his hands, palms wide, as if surrendering his right to urgency. But he didn't, because he wasn't running away. He was running toward a little girl, no older than 7, sitting on the floor near a waiting area. Her face pale, her lips parted in short, struggling breaths. A woman knelt beside her, fumbling with a phone, her voice frantic as she pressed the call button for emergency services. She left it at home. The woman kept repeating, as if saying it enough times would undo it. "I told her to check. I told her." An inhaler. That's what the man held. A lifeline, a second chance, an answer clutched in a trembling hand. None of that mattered. Not to KS. Not to the way the world worked. A tackle fast, brutal, the sound of bodies hitting the floor, of a grunt cut short by impact. The inhaler flew from his grasp, landing just inches from the little girl. The gasp that followed didn't come from the child but from the people around them. The ones who had been silent spectators until now. Kiana felt something inside her coil. A tight, breath-stealing thing that was part anger, part exhaustion. It was always like this. The wrong questions asked, the wrong conclusions drawn. She moved before she could think better of it, before she could remind herself to keep her head down. The inhale before the storm. "What are you doing?" The words weren't a whisper. They weren't cautious. They rang through the air, clear as a bell, sharp as a blade. KS turned his head, his knee still pressed against the man's back, his hand gripping the radio at his belt. His smirk from earlier was gone, replaced with the kind of expression that men wore when they realized they had an audience. Kiana pointed not at him, but at the child. "Look." Others turned, their gazes shifting from the man on the ground to the little girl gasping for breath. Her mother scrambling to reach for the inhaler that had rolled just beyond her grasp. Someone else moved, a flight attendant. Maybe, her uniform neat and crisp. Her hands steady as she scooped up the inhaler and pressed it into the child's shaking hands. A slow inhale, the metallic click of the medicine releasing. A breath, a pause, a moment of understanding that came too late. KS's grip loosened, just slightly, just enough for the man beneath him to turn his face to the side. to speak through labored breaths. "She's my daughter." It was over. And yet, it wasn't, because the apology would never come. The acknowledgement, the regret, the understanding that hesitation had nearly cost a child her breath, none of it would be spoken. The officers moved, releasing, stepping back, their hands suddenly unsure of where they belonged. KS straightened his uniform. But his jaw was tight. His nostrils flared. He wasn't angry at what had happened, he was angry that it had been witnessed. The little girl reached for her father, her small fingers finding his sleeve, tugging, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Daddy?" Kiana let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. There would be no justice in this moment. There would be no accountability. The officers would step away. The mother would wipe her eyes. The bystanders would move along, returning to their flights, to their schedules, to their silent agreements with comfort. But Kiana wasn't done. She turned to KS, to the man who had smirked at her ID, who had played with her dignity like it was something to be toyed with. And she spoke the only truth that mattered. "You almost killed a child today." The words hung between them, undeniable, unshakable. KS's lip curled, his hands twitched, his body a coiled wire of unchecked power and wounded pride. But he said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Kiana adjusted the strap of her backpack, her pulse steady now, her steps unhurried as she turned away. She had a flight to catch. But as she walked, as she moved past the crowd, past the woman clutching her daughter, past the man now kneeling, forehead pressed against his child's small shoulder, she knew this was not over. The airport had a way of swallowing moments whole, grinding them down into a kind of unspoken history that travelers either forgot or chose not to see. The world moved fast in places like this, urgency humming in every footstep, in every hurried sip of coffee, in every last-minute glance at a boarding pass. But some things did not move on so easily. Some things settled in the air, unseen but felt, lingering like the faint scent of cologne long after someone has left the room. The moment at the security checkpoint, the weight of it, the near tragedy of it was still there, following Kiana like an unwelcome shadow as she walked through the terminal. Past flashing departure boards and voices making small talk over overpriced sandwiches. She kept her stride even, her breathing measured, but her thoughts were restless. She had seen it before, seen the way power pressed down on the wrong people. The way authority twisted itself into something unrecognizable when left unchecked. And yet, the most frustrating part was knowing how the world would digest what had just happened. There would be no headlines, no inquiries, just a man almost tackled into the cold tile floor for trying to save his own daughter. Just another ordinary day in a place where ordinary meant accepting the unacceptable. Her gate wasn't far now, and she told herself that was the only thing that mattered. The next step, the forward motion, that was how you survived in places like this. But then, as if fate had decided she wasn't done yet, another moment pulled at the edges of her awareness, a ripple stretching outward from the center of something much larger than herself. A woman's voice, sharp with irritation, cut through the low hum of airport noise. "Excuse me? I paid for this seat. I shouldn't have to sit next to him." Kiana turned her head, her body moving before she could remind herself to mind her own business. Just a few gates down, a white woman in a crisp linen blazer stood with her arms folded tight across her chest. Her lips pursed in disgust as she glared at a flight attendant. The source of her disdain, a black man sitting calmly in his assigned seat, his fingers resting on the armrest like he was trying not to clench them. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, he just sat there, shoulders squared, eyes fixed ahead, enduring. The flight attendant, a young woman with a tight bun and tired eyes, was trying. Kiana could tell. She was explaining, hands moving in small, controlled gestures, voice pitched just low enough to keep the conversation from drawing more attention than it already had. "Ma'am, this is your assigned seat. And we cannot make changes unless—" "I don't care." The woman's voice rose, pushing past the limits of quiet diplomacy. "I don't feel comfortable sitting next to him. Find me another seat." There it was, not an accusation, not an insult, but a statement laced with all the things she wouldn't say outright. "I don't feel comfortable." A sentence designed to sound like a personal preference, but one that carried the weight of a much older, much uglier history. Kiana's feet stopped moving. She should keep walking. She had done enough for one day. And yet, something in her refused to let this slide. Refused to let this be another unchallenged moment that faded into nothing. Because silence, she had learned, was an agreement, and she was not going to agree to this. She stepped forward, just enough to make herself visible, just enough to tilt the balance of the moment. You don't feel comfortable? Her voice was even, steady. She wasn't looking at the woman, she was looking at the flight attendant. Offering her an opening, an option, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. The woman turned sharply, her gaze locking onto Kiana with a mix of surprise and irritation. Like she hadn't expected an audience. Excuse me? You said you don't feel comfortable. Kiana repeated, her words smooth, deliberate. I was just wondering why. The woman hesitated, caught off guard in a way that people often were when asked to explain the things they had never been forced to justify. Her mouth opened, then closed, her mind clearly reaching for an answer that wouldn't make her the villain in this story. Kiana tilted her head slightly. Waiting. The flight attendant, sensing the shift in energy, squared her shoulders. Ma'am, as I was saying, you are welcome to remain in your assigned seat. Or we can check with the gate agent about alternative options. The words were the same, but something about them felt different now. A little stronger, a little less apologetic. The woman huffed, her cheeks coloring, and then without another word she turned and stomped back toward the counter, where she would no doubt demand to speak to someone with authority. Kiana let out a slow breath. The man in the seat had not moved, had not spoken, but now, finally, he turned his head ever so slightly. Meeting her gaze, there was nothing dramatic about the moment. No grand gestures, no whispered thank yous, just a slow, knowing nod, the kind that said, I saw what you did. I see you. Kiana nodded back and walked away. The gate was just ahead now. The overhead screen flashing the boarding time for her flight. She should feel relieved, she thought, should feel like she had won something, like she had done enough. But there was no satisfaction in any of this. Not really, because these moments would keep happening, over and over, to different people, in different places. And yet, she also knew this. A ripple is not just a disturbance, it is a sign of movement. And movement is how things begin to change. Even here, even now, even in the places where people aren't watching. The airport had settled back into its rhythm. People moved with purpose but without urgency. Sipping coffee from paper cups. Scrolling through their phones. Listening for their boarding calls with the kind of practiced detachment that travel required. Kiana should have felt the same, should have let her body relax into the familiar anticipation of departure. But she couldn't. Not after the security checkpoint. Not after the father tackled to the ground. Not after the woman at the gate, clutching her privilege like a pearl necklace, demanding to be relocated as if proximity to a black man was a personal offense. She carried it all with her, a weight that wasn't heavy so much as constant. And yet, she was used to it, used to swallowing the anger, smoothing over the edges, moving forward. That was survival. That was the unspoken rule. Don't let them see how much it costs you. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, shifting her weight from one foot to the other as she stood by the window near her gate, watching planes roll in and out of the runway like a carefully choreographed dance. Houston was only a few hours away. A return to normalcy. A reset. That's what she told herself. Though part of her wasn't sure she believed it. And then, just as she let out a breath, a voice broke through the hum of the airport, cutting straight through the illusion of calm. Ma'am? Excuse me, are you Kiana Atkins? She turned, finding a TSA officer standing a few feet away. Not KS. Someone else. Someone with softer eyes but the same uniform. The same badge. The same unshakable authority. Her spine stiffened. Yes. The officer nodded. Professional but unreadable. Would you mind coming with me for a moment? There was no explanation. No immediate reassurance that she wasn't in trouble. Just an open-ended request wrapped in the kind of phrasing that left no room for refusal. Heads turned as she followed the officer past the rows of chairs. Past the people pretending not to notice. That was the thing about airports. People saw everything, but they rarely intervened. No one stopped her. No one asked if she was okay. They just watched. Or worse, they didn't. She was led through a door marked Airport Police Administration. The air inside different from the terminal, quieter. Heavier. Like the space between a question and its answer. A woman waited for her, standing with the kind of posture that only came with years of command. She wasn't TSA. Not security. Someone else. Someone higher up. Kiana Atkins? the woman said, extending a hand. I'm Captain Morris. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. Kiana shook her hand, though confusion rippled through her. Did I do something wrong? Captain Morris smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. Not at all. In fact, I wanted to personally apologize for what happened at security. Kiana blinked. Apologize. The word felt foreign, out of place. People like her didn't usually get apologies. They got explanations, excuses, maybe a shrug, if the person in power was feeling generous. She folded her arms. Guarded. You mean KS? Morris nodded, her jaw tightening ever so slightly. Yes, I've received multiple complaints about Officer KS over the last few months. Today's incident only reinforced what we've been hearing. I want you to know that we take this seriously. Kiana let the words settle, waiting for the inevitable, but the officer was just doing his job. But security protocols are in place for a reason. But this is all just a misunderstanding. It didn't come. Instead, Morris exhaled, glancing at the folder on the desk. I read your file. Ms. Atkins, you're a graduate student in clinical psychology. You've done research on bias in institutional systems. Kiana's brows lifted slightly. You did your homework. Morris smiled wryly. I try, which is why I'm sure you already know that issues like this don't disappear overnight. But they do require people willing to speak up, which is why I called you here. Kiana's pulse ticked up. She didn't like where this was going. I'd like to formally document your experience. Morris continued. We need records, patterns, evidence. These reports matter when it comes to internal reviews. I understand if you just want to move on. But if you're willing to put your statement in writing, it could make a difference. Kiana hesitated, fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. This was the part no one warned you about. The cost of speaking up. The exhaustion of reliving it. Of being asked to provide proof for something you knew was real. It was always like this. The burden placed on the wrong shoulders. The weight never evenly distributed. She thought about the father on the floor. The little girl gasping for air. The man at the gate, sitting still while someone else decided he was a problem. She thought about how easy it would be to say no. But easy had never been the point. She sat down, exhaled slowly, and nodded. Okay, she said, let's do it. Morris slid a notepad toward her, and Kiana picked up the pen. And just like that, the ripple turned into a wave. The airport never stopped moving, even in moments of silence. There was a pulse, a hum beneath it all. The rhythm of doors sliding open, footsteps tapping against polished floors. The distant chime of final boarding calls. Kiana stepped out of the administrative office and into that ever-moving current. But something had shifted. The air felt different against her skin. She had left behind her statement. Her words locked in ink. But the weight of them still lingered. Would it matter? Would it change anything? Or would it be filed away? Lost in a system designed to forget? She didn't have time to answer that question. Because before she could take another step toward her gate, the airport cracked open with the sound of raised voices. Not far from where she stood, a crowd had gathered near a gate 29. Their heads turned in the same direction. Eyes locked on a single scene unfolding in real time. And at the center of it, just as she somehow expected, was him, Officer KS. His stance was wide, shoulders squared, voice sharp enough to slice through the low drone of travel announcements. He wasn't alone. A man stood opposite him, his face flushed with anger. His suit jacket wrinkled like he had been grabbed. His hands were up not in surrender, but in frustration, in disbelief. In the universal language of "Are you serious right now?" I asked a question, the man was saying, his voice even but charged. And you put your hands on me? KS didn't flinch. You were raising your voice at staff. The man let out a breath, somewhere between a laugh and a growl. I asked the gate agent if there were any other seats available. That's all I did. What part of that sounded threatening to you? Kiana's stomach clenched. She knew that answer before KS even opened his mouth. Sir, I need you to calm down. A textbook response. The oldest trick in the book. Make him the problem. Make his reaction the issue. Redirect. Reframe. Put the target on the wrong back. It was happening again. Kiana wasn't the only one who saw it. The crowd murmured, restless, shifting like an audience unsure if they were allowed to intervene. Someone was already recording. Their phone tilted just enough to catch KS's stance. The stiffness in his jaw. The way his fingers curled at his sides like he was daring the man to push further. And then, slicing through the moment like a knife, came another voice, one full of authority, full of finality. Officer KS. The crowd parted as Captain Morris approached. Her expression unreadable but her presence unmistakable. She didn't hesitate, didn't waver. She walked straight toward KS, her badge flashing beneath the harsh airport lights. He turned, surprised, his stance faltering for just a fraction of a second. "What's going on here?" Morris asked, her voice controlled, measured. KS opened his mouth. But before he could get a word out, the businessman, his victim, jumped in. "What's going on is that your officer put his hands on me because I asked a flight-related question." His voice was clear, steady, the kind of voice that had spent years in boardrooms, in negotiations, in places where words mattered. "I was never aggressive. I never raised a hand. But the second I didn't smile and nod, I became a problem." Morris turned to KS. And this time, her voice was steel. "Is that true?" KS's face was tight, the mask cracking. "I was trying to de-escalate." Morris nodded once. "Slow. De-escalate from what?" KS hesitated. It was slight, barely visible, but it was there, and Kiana knew it was over. The silence stretched. The crowd was still now, waiting. They had all seen what had happened. The cameras had seen it too. And Morris, she saw it too. She took a step forward, lowering her voice, but there was no softness in it. "Step away from this passenger." KS didn't move, not immediately. Morris's eyes hardened. "That's an order." And finally, KS stepped back. The businessman adjusted his jacket, straightened his tie. "I'll be filing a complaint," he said, looking directly at Morris, making sure she understood that he would not let this go. Morris nodded. "And I will personally make sure it's reviewed." KS's jaw clenched, but he knew everyone knew this moment had shifted out of his control. It was no longer his game to play. Morris turned to him, her voice firm, unwavering. "Come with me." The crowd parted again as they walked away. No one clapped, no one cheered. That wasn't the kind of moment this was. But something had cracked in the foundation. The ripples had spread too far. And this time, they couldn't be ignored. Kiana let out a slow breath, her fingers still tight around the strap of her bag. It wasn't everything. It wasn't justice. Not yet. But it was something. And sometimes, something was the first step toward everything. The energy at the gate had shifted. But the airport never stopped. The moment dissolved into movement, people adjusting their carry-ons, flight attendants making final announcements, passengers stretching their legs before being crammed into narrow rows for hours at a time. It would have been easy to pretend nothing had happened at all, to let the scene at Gate 29 fade into the background noise of airport life. Another moment buried under the weight of 1,000 other distractions. But Kiana felt it. It clung to her skin, an electric charge that wouldn't settle. She walked toward her gate, pulling her boarding pass from her pocket, letting her body move through the motions of travel. The incident with Officer KS was done. At least for now. Captain Morris had taken control. And for the first time, Kiana had seen something rare: a consequence. However temporary. But even consequences didn't guarantee change. The real work came later. In the quiet moments when no one was watching. When the decision had to be made whether to let things slip back into silence or push forward. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, offering a polite nod as she moved down the jet bridge. The weight of her backpack pressed into her shoulders, grounding her, reminding her that she was almost there. Almost free of this place. Almost on her way home. But just as she reached the plane's entrance, the flight attendant stationed at the door lifted a hand. "Miss Atkins?" The shift was immediate. A ripple of attention from the passengers behind her. A pause in the natural rhythm of boarding. Like a sudden missed step in a well-rehearsed dance. Kiana's grip tightened around the strap of her bag. "Yes?" The flight attendant's smile was polite. But there was something uneasy behind it. Like she already knew she was about to say something that wouldn't be well received. "I'm so sorry, but we've been asked to hold you here for just a moment." Kiana felt it before she even knew what it was. The drop. The gut punch of déjà vu. Of knowing exactly what was coming but being powerless to stop it. She had already played this game once today. Already felt the weight of someone else deciding where she could and couldn't go. "Hold me?" Her voice stayed even, but she made sure it didn't sound like a question. "It's just a quick security verification," the flight attendant said, glancing toward the front of the jet bridge where two uniformed airport security officers were approaching. The world didn't stop moving. But Kiana's did. Passengers continued to board around her, squeezing past with murmured apologies. Some too preoccupied to notice. Others shooting quick glances before looking away. The way people do when they don't want to get involved. One of the officers, a younger man with dark hair cropped close, gave her a quick nod, as if that somehow softened what was happening. "Miss Atkins, we just need to verify something before you board." Kiana let out a slow breath, forcing herself to remain still, to not let them see how her pulse had spiked. "And what exactly needs verifying?" The officer hesitated. That was the thing about moments like this, hesitation was its own kind of confession. "It won't take long," he said, which wasn't an answer at all. Kiana glanced toward the plane, toward the passengers settling into their seats, oblivious to the fact that one of their fellow travelers had just been stopped at the door. She turned back to the officer. "Is this about KS?" That flicker of something passed across his face just for a second. He knew exactly what she was talking about. "You've been flagged for a security review," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "We just need to clear it before you can board." Flagged, a vague, meaningless word used to justify 1,000 tiny acts of control. A word that gave them permission to pause her life like a TV remote. To hold her in place without ever actually saying why. She could see it now, how easily this could escalate. How quickly a moment like this could spiral if she wasn't careful. A raised voice would be aggressive. A refusal would be noncompliance. Anything but quiet submission would become its own excuse for why this was happening in the first place. But she wasn't going to make this easy for them. "All right," she said, adjusting her bag. "Then let's do this in front of everyone. Right here. Let's make sure the whole plane sees exactly what's going on." The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the officers as if silently willing them to rethink their approach. The officer hesitated again, longer this time. This wasn't what they wanted. They wanted her to step aside, to be quietly escorted back into the shadows where things like this were easier to get away with. But Kiana wasn't moving. And then, from behind her, another voice. "Is there a problem here?" A different officer had appeared, the same one from earlier. Officer Reed, the one Captain Morris had sent to wrap up KS's mess. His arrival was like a record scratch, disrupting whatever script had been unfolding. He glanced at Kiana, then at the two officers. "She's clear," he said, his voice firm. Captain Morris already handled this. The tension shifted. The younger officer's jaw tightened. But he nodded. "Understood." Just like that, the moment ended. Kiana let out a slow breath. But she didn't move immediately. She stayed there, just long enough to make sure they knew that she knew exactly what had just happened. Then, without another word, she stepped onto the plane. The flight attendant, visibly relieved, gave her an apologetic look. "I'm sorry about that," she murmured. Kiana met her gaze. "Steady. Don't be. Just pay attention when it happens again." And then, finally, she walked down the narrow aisle, past passengers settling in, past people who would never know how close she had come to missing this flight. She slid into her seat, buckled her belt, and let her head rest against the window as the engines rumbled to life. She had made it, but the fight wasn't over. Not even close. The plane rumbled beneath her, vibrating with the energy of a machine built to defy gravity. Outside the small window, the world was shrinking, the sprawling grid of the city dissolving into the soft haze of clouds. Kiana exhaled slowly, pressing her head against the cool glass, letting the weight of the day settle, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. She had made it, against the odds, against the friction of forces determined to hold her back. She was in the air, heading home, but even at 30,000 feet, she knew this wasn't over. She reached for her phone, switching it out of airplane mode, her fingers hovering over the screen. Messages flooded in, her best friend checking in, her mentor reminding her about their meeting tomorrow, a handful of notifications from social media. And then, the unexpected. A video, a link, a headline. "Airport officer oversteps again." She clicked it, and there it was, grainy phone footage, shot from the edge of the crowd at Gate 29. The moment KS put his hands on the businessman. The way Captain Morris stepped in. The murmurs of the bystanders. The sharp intake of breath when KS was ordered to stand down. Someone had been recording, and someone had shared it. She scrolled. The video had already gained traction. Comments poured in, voices debating, dissecting. reacting. Some expressed outrage. Others dismissed it as another, isolated incident. But Kiana knew better. Nothing about this was isolated. It was part of a pattern. A thread in a tapestry woven long before today. She sat back, watching the world below drift further away. Her thoughts no longer tangled in the fear of what had almost happened but in the responsibility of what came next. Because that was the thing about moments like this, they didn't just belong to the people who lived them. They belonged to everyone watching. Everyone who had ever been in that position. Everyone who would be. Her mother had always told her, when the world tries to shrink you, take up more space. Kiana straightened, opening a blank message, her fingers moving before she had fully formed the thought. Dr. Lee, I need to talk to you about something bigger than our meeting tomorrow. I think we have an opportunity to make some real noise. Call me when you're free. She hit send, closed her eyes, and let the steady hum of the aircraft fill the silence. The fight wasn't over, but this time, she wasn't just a passenger. She was taking control of the flight path. The city lights stretched far and wide beneath her as the plane descended. A constellation of highways and neighborhoods, office buildings and homes, all glowing like a living organism pulsing beneath the night sky. Houston, home, the place where she could finally breathe. But Kiana really knew that this time, she wasn't just coming home. She was arriving with purpose. Her phone buzzed the second the wheels kissed the runway, jolting back to life as the messages flooded in. The video from Gate 29 had taken on a life of its own. Bouncing across platforms, reaching eyes she had never expected. News outlets had picked it up. People were asking questions. People were watching. And that meant there was no turning back. She walked through the terminal with her bags slung over one shoulder. Her mind racing ahead of her body. The weight of the day still clung to her. But it had changed, reshaped itself into something sharper. If the world wanted her to be silent, it had miscalculated. By the time she stepped outside, the humid Texas air wrapped around her, thick and familiar, grounding her in a way she hadn't realized she needed. And there, waiting near the curb, was her mother, arms crossed, face lined with the kind of knowing concern only a mother could have. Kiana barely had time to pull her bag over her shoulder before she was wrapped in the warmth of an embrace that smelled like home, like shea butter and lavender. Like safety. I saw, her mother murmured against her hair, voice steady but tinged with something unsaid. I saw everything. They didn't speak again until they were driving. The city unfolding outside the window. Neon signs flickering against the wet pavement from a recent rain. Kiana stared out at it all, her fingers tracing absent-minded patterns against her thigh. Her thoughts colliding like traffic at rush hour. You don't have to fight every battle, baby, her mother finally said, voice gentle but firm. Kiana turned, meeting her mother's eyes in the dim glow of the dashboard. No, she said quietly. But I have to fight this one. The words settled between them, heavy but understood. By the time they pulled into the driveway, she had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this moment fade into the endless cycle of outrage and forgetting. People needed to see it, to understand it, to feel it, the discomfort, the fear, the exhaustion, and the absolute refusal to let it keep happening. She took a deep breath, pulled out her laptop, and started typing. A post, a statement, not just about what had happened to her, but about what it meant about the father tackled to the floor. The businessman shoved aside, the thousands who had gone through it before and the thousands more who would if nothing changed. Her mother sat across from her, watching, nodding slowly. Say what needs to be said, she murmured. So Kiana did. By the time the sun rose, the world was listening. And this time, she wasn't asking for permission to be heard.